This story happened to Victor a few years ago. It was late in the evening, and he was on a road trip to his great-uncle's house to celebrate his birthday. He lived quite far from Victor's house, about a good 8 hours by car. Halfway there, he had to stop to refuel. The nearest gas station looked rather shady. Victor felt uncomfortable as soon as he got out of the car. He refueled, then went inside to pay, in the store. He saw that they had snacks, so he also bought something to drink and snack on. He paid for his snacks as well as his fuel, then he went back outside. Outside, he saw another car. It was black and the windows were tinted, so he couldn't see inside. The car was parked crookedly in the lot. Victor ignored it and got back into his car to continue on his way. His route took him through the countryside, where the roads were not lit. After 5 minutes of driving, he noticed that the black car was following him. He tried to tell himself it was just a coincidence and continued on. But the car passed him and began to lose control. Victor managed to overtake it in return and slammed on the accelerator. He wanted to get out of the area quickly, so he went faster and faster, until he ultimately lost control of his car and fell into a ditch. He tried to call for help, but there was no signal. He was forced to walk in hopes of finding assistance, and saw the black car again. This time, the driver got out of the car, and when Victor looked at him, he felt fear take over. The man had long brown hair and a deformed jaw, as if someone had broken it. He had scratches all over his face and arms, and a psychopathic smile on his face. He lunged at Victor and bit his arm. Victor tried to break free, but the man refused to let go. He pulled out a knife and tried to stab him, and Victor thought it was the end. At the same moment, sirens were heard. The man put the knife back in his pocket, and he looked with the same disturbed smile before running into the forest. Victor signaled to the police and told them what he had just experienced. One of the officers went into the forest and managed to apprehend Victor's attacker. Apparently, the man had escaped from a psychiatric hospital a week and a half earlier and had stolen one of the nurse's car. The police helped Victor call a tow truck, and when he finally arrived in town, he rented a car to go to his great-uncle's birthday. But he couldn't stop thinking about the man. If the police had arrived just 1 minute later, Victor would have ended up in the news. Many people do not believe what happened to Raphael, but he sincerely hopes that someone here will believe that the horror he experienced is very real, so that it can ease a little of the pain it causes him. That is why he wishes to share his story. 7 years ago at dawn, Raphael suddenly woke up, goosebumps covering his entire body. When his eyes adjusted to the darkness, his heart stopped for a second. There were 7 people with knives in hand staring at him. Their faces were covered in white paint. At that moment, Raphael was able to discover that when one reaches this level of fear, no voice comes out of our throat. As if they were waiting for Raphael to wake up, they brought their knife close to his face, 7 knives around his head, leaving only a poor centimeter of space. If he moved his head even a little, he would be stabbed from all sides, paralyzed. He looked around him. These people laughed like psychopaths, still staring at him. Raphael finally managed to scream. One of them put his knife right under his throat to silence him, and he asked them why they were doing this while sobbing. They didn't say a word. Instead, they breathed in a grotesque manner, as if they were animals unable to speak. Raphael tried to escape before realizing that his arms and legs were tied. His body was covered in sweat. He thought it was a nightmare, but unfortunately, it was indeed reality. They threatened him with their knife for hours. And during all that time, Raphael begged them 100 times to let him go. But his attackers did not react at all. He suffered from such intense horror for so long that he eventually fainted. The next morning, upon reopening his eyes, he vomited everywhere. He had a terrible migraine. His window was broken and open, but no other trace of his attackers could be found anywhere. Raphael couldn't breathe properly, and his heart was beating 3 times its usual rate. He collapsed onto his bed, trembling all over. He couldn't believe what had happened to him. He reported the incident to the police, but the investigation was not easy. Given that there were no injuries on Raphael's body and that there were no traces at his home, they couldn't do anything. He stayed at a friend's place for a while, but he had terrible nightmares every night. But this is not the end of the story. One day, he heard that a woman in her 60s had died of a heart attack in her sleep. A neighbor had noticed that her window was broken and reported it to the police. When they arrived at the scene, they concluded that she had died of natural causes, as there were no injuries on her body. There were no other fingerprints but his, and no other clues at all. But Raphael knew what had happened to him. It was them, he was sure. He alerted the police, and when they asked him to describe the criminals again, he couldn't be precise because all of them had their faces covered in pain. Raphael eventually moved away and did not know if his attackers had been arrested, but he continues to suffer from nightmares to this day, 7 years later. Just last night, he jumped out of bed because he felt a blade on his face. But this time, it was just his imagination. After such intense panic, he couldn't fall back asleep. And at 4 a.m., he wrote his story to share it with us, because he can't close his eyes. He still doesn't know why his attackers did this to him. What was their motive? But now, after 7 years have passed, this incident remains a mystery, and the terrible trauma it left him is far from resolved.